The heavy glass tray felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but Lisa didn't complain. She had been carrying trays just like it for 20 years, ever since she dropped out of college to help her parents pay the rent. Now, at 45, her shoulders were permanently rounded from the weight of other people's dinners, other people's wine, and other people's empty laughter. She worked at a place called the Gilded Key, a fancy restaurant in the center of the city where the ceilings were high and the prices were higher. The air inside the restaurant always smelled the same. It was a thick mix of expensive perfume, roasted garlic, and melted butter. It was the kind of smell that made you hungry if you were a customer, but made you feel sick if you were a waiter. Lisa moved through the crowded room like she was invisible. She knew how to slide between the tightly packed tables without bumping into a single chair. She knew exactly when to refill a water glass before the person even realized it was empty. She was good at her job. She was fast. She was polite. But nobody really saw her. To the people wearing diamond necklaces and silk suits, she was just part of the furniture. She was the person who brought the steak and took away the empty plates. She was nothing more than a shadow in a black uniform. Tonight was an especially busy night. The restaurant was completely booked. There was a big event happening. A very famous piano player was scheduled to perform after dinner. His name was Julian Ross. Lisa didn't know much about him, other than that he was known for being difficult, and that he charged more money for 1 hour of playing than Lisa made in 6 months. The customers were buzzing with excitement. They were dressed in their finest clothes, drinking expensive wine, and talking loudly about how much culture they had. Lisa stopped at table 12 to drop off the check. It was a table for 4. 2 couples who had been rude to her all night. They snapped their fingers when they wanted her, and they didn't look her in the eye when she spoke. "Here is your bill, sir," Lisa said softly, placing the leather folder on the pristine white tablecloth. The man didn't even turn his head. He just kept talking to the woman next to him about a vacation he took in France. Lisa waited for a moment, hoping he would at least acknowledge her, but he just waved his hand dismissively, as if he were swatting away a fly. She felt that familiar sting in her chest, the one she felt almost every day. It was a mix of sadness and anger that she had learned to swallow down. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her feet aching inside her non-slip shoes. Back in the kitchen, the noise was overwhelming. Chefs were shouting orders, pots were clanging, and the heat from the stoves was unbearable. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She looked at her hands. They were red and rough. The skin on her fingertips was peeling a little from the hot water she used to wash dishes. She tried to remember a time when her hands were smooth. She tried to remember the last time she had painted her nails or worn a ring that wasn't from a vending machine. In the corner of the kitchen, hidden behind a stack of flour sacks, was a small, old radio. Sometimes, when the chef wasn't looking, Lisa would turn the dial just a little bit to hear the classical music station. It was her secret escape. She closed her eyes for just a second and let the sound of a violin wash over her. She remembered the apartment she grew up in. It was small and drafty, but in the living room stood an old, upright piano. It was out of tune, and some of the keys stuck, but it was hers. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to pay for those lessons. Lisa had practiced every single day. She played until her fingers hurt. She played until she could feel the music in her bones. Her teacher used to tell her that she had a gift, that she could play with more feeling than anyone he had ever met. But life is rarely like the movies. Her mother got sick, the medical bills piled up, and the piano had to be sold. The music stopped, and the working began. She promised herself she would go back to it one day, but one day turned into 20 years. "Lisa, table 4 is waiting," the chef shouted, snapping her back to reality. She opened her eyes, cleared her throat, and grabbed a tray of appetizers. The dream was gone, replaced by the smell of sizzling meat. She pushed through the swinging doors and back into the elegant dining room. As the night went on, the mood in the restaurant began to change. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 9 o'clock. That was when the piano performance was supposed to start. A small stage had been set up in the corner of the room near the large window. A shiny black grand piano sat there under a spotlight. It looked beautiful. It looked lonely. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A man in a long coat was yelling at the manager. It was Julian Ross, the famous piano player. He was red in the face, waving his arms around. "This is unacceptable," the musician shouted. His voice was loud and echoed through the quiet room, making the customers stop eating and stare. The air conditioning is too cold. It will ruin my fingers. I cannot play under these conditions. The manager, a thin man with a sweaty forehead, tried to calm him down. Sir, please, we have a full house. Everyone is waiting. We can turn up the heat. Just, please, go to the stage. It is too late, Julian screamed. My mood is ruined. My artistic flow is blocked. I will not perform for people who do not respect the environment. He looked around the room with disgust. He looked at the waiters, the diners, and the velvet curtains as if they were all trash. I am leaving. Do not expect me back. He turned on his heel and stormed out the glass doors, leaving the restaurant in a stunned silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The customers looked at each other, confused and annoyed. Then, the murmuring started. It started low, like a rumble of thunder, and grew louder. People were unhappy. They had paid a lot of money for this dinner and the show. This is ridiculous, one woman said loudly. I came here for the music. What a scam, a man at a nearby table grumbled. If there is no show, I want my money back. The manager looked panicked. He ran his hands through his hair, looking from the empty doorway to the angry crowd. He was losing control. The atmosphere in the room, which had been fancy and bright, now felt heavy and dangerous. It felt like a storm was brewing inside the walls of the Gilded Key. Lisa stood near the kitchen door, watching it all unfold. She felt bad for the manager, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. She knew that famous people often forgot about the regular folks who paid their salaries. The manager started pacing back and forth, looking for a solution. He needed a miracle. He needed someone to save the night. He needed someone to play that big, black piano sitting in the corner. His eyes scanned the room desperately, looking for help, but he only saw angry customers and scared waiters. He was about to walk onto the stage to make an announcement, to beg for patience, when he stopped. He looked right at Lisa. He remembered something. He remembered a night, years ago, when the restaurant had closed late and the cleaning crew had gone home. He had heard music coming from the dining room. Soft, sad, beautiful music. He had walked in and seen Lisa sitting at the old upright piano they used to have in the back, her eyes closed, lost in the melody. He looked at her rough hands, holding a tray of dirty glasses. He looked at her tired face. It was a crazy idea. It was a terrible risk. But he was desperate. He took a deep breath and walked straight toward her. The manager moved quickly, weaving through the tables with a look of sheer panic on his face. He wasn't looking at the rich customers. He was looking right at her. Lisa saw him coming and felt a sudden knot tighten in her stomach. She knew that look. It was the look of a boss who needed a miracle, and usually that meant more work for the staff. She tried to step back into the shadow of the service station, hoping he would walk past her, but he stopped directly in front of her. He was breathing hard, and his forehead was covered in sweat. "You play, don't you?" he asked. His voice low and urgent. It wasn't really a question, it was a plea. Lisa shook her head instinctively, gripping the tray of dirty glasses tighter against her chest. "No, sir," she lied. "I mean, I haven't played in years. I'm just a waitress." The manager ignored her denial. He remembered that late night years ago. He remembered the sound that floated through the empty restaurant, a sound that didn't match the worn-out uniform or the tired posture of the woman who made it. He looked past her, toward the dining room. The angry murmurs were getting louder. People were putting down their forks. The magic of the evening had completely evaporated, replaced by a tense, ugly mood. He knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, before people started demanding their money back, or worse, walking out. "I don't care if you haven't played since you were a baby," he hissed, leaning in closer so the customers wouldn't hear. "That man just walked out. We have a sold-out crowd. If they don't get a show, this restaurant's reputation is ruined. We are going to lose so much money tonight." Lisa's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She looked over his shoulder at the grand piano, sitting on the small stage. It looked enormous under the spotlight. It looked like a beast waiting to swallow her whole. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at me. I don't belong up there. These people came to see a star. They'll hate me. They'll throw things." "They just want music," the manager insisted, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was tight, not to hurt her, but out of desperation. They don't care who plays, they just want to hear something. Go up there, play anything, play scales, play nursery rhymes. Just give them something to listen to so they calm down. I don't know any scales, she stammered. My fingers are stiff. I serve soup all day, sir. I can't just switch it off. You have to, he said, his eyes begging her. He wasn't the boss anymore. He was just a man drowning. Please, Lisa, do it for us. Do it for the tips. If you walk out there and save this night, I will give you every bonus I can afford. I will double your wages for the month. The mention of money hit her hard. Lisa thought about the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. She thought about the rent increase notice she had received that morning. She thought about her old car that made a horrible noise every time she turned the steering wheel. She was tired. She was so incredibly tired of being tired. But the fear of embarrassing herself in front of 200 strangers was stronger than her need for money. She shook her head again, pulling her arm away slightly. I can't, she said, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. I'll freeze up. The manager's face hardened. He was out of time. The room was turning into a mob. He saw a man stand up near the front, looking ready to cause a scene. He made a split-second decision. He didn't ask any more. He didn't beg. He simply turned her around by her shoulders and gave her a gentle but firm push toward the stage. Just go, he said firmly. Don't think, just walk. Lisa stumbled forward. She wanted to run the other way. She wanted to drop her tray and sprint out the back door into the alley. But the push had set her in motion, and her legs seemed to move on their own. She put the tray down on a nearby table with a clatter. The sound of the glass hitting the silverware made a few people look at her, but most eyes were still on the manager or the empty door where the star had left. She walked toward the stage. It felt like the longest walk of her life. With every step, her legs felt heavier, like she was walking through deep mud. The restaurant seemed to stretch out. The distance between the service station and the piano felt like a mile. She could feel the eyes of the room beginning to shift toward her. They sensed movement. They saw a woman in a black uniform stepping into the light. Why was she going there? Is she the sound check? Is she the tuner? As she climbed the 3 small steps up to the platform, the carpet felt soft under her shoes. The spotlight hit her face, blinding her. She couldn't see the audience anymore. She could only feel them. She could feel their presence like a heavy weight pressing down on her shoulders. She could hear the rustle of fabric, the clinking of ice in glasses, and the low hum of confused whispers. Lisa reached the piano bench. It was a polished, glossy black bench that looked too fancy to touch. She hesitated. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. This was a mistake. She was a fraud. She was just a waitress who served chicken and potatoes. She didn't have a fancy degree. She didn't have a tuxedo. She was wearing a polyester uniform that was slightly too big in the shoulders and smelled faintly of fried food. She looked out into the darkness, trying to find an exit, but the lights were too bright. She was trapped. "Play!" someone shouted from the back of the room. It wasn't a shout of encouragement. It was a shout of impatience. "We paid for music." "Yeah, stop wasting time," another voice added. The manager stood near the edge of the stage, his hands clasped together in a silent prayer. He looked terrified. Lisa looked at him, and for a second, she felt a flash of pity for him. He was going to lose his job if this went wrong. She was going to lose hers too, probably. But she was already here. The spotlight was already on her. There was no graceful way to walk back down now. Slowly, awkwardly, she sat down on the bench. It was hard and cold. She felt small behind the massive body of the grand piano. The instrument was shiny and perfect, reflecting the lights like a mirror. It smelled of lemon oil and expensive wood. She placed her hands on her knees. They were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to make them stop. She looked at the keys. They were white and black, waiting for her. They looked intimidating. They were pristine, untouched by the grease and grime of the kitchen world she lived in. She felt unworthy touching them. The room was getting restless. The murmurs were turning into boos. A few people laughed, thinking it was a joke. They thought the manager was sending a waitress up there to tell them a joke or to apologize. They didn't know what was coming. Neither did Lisa. She took a deep breath, trying to fill her lungs with air, but it felt like the room had no oxygen. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, a thumping rhythm that drowned out the chatter. Thump, 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 thump. She thought about her mother. She thought about the old beat-up piano in the living room. She remembered how the keys used to stick, especially the C sharp, and how she had to use extra force to get the sound out. She remembered how music used to be the only thing that made her feel like she was more than just a poor girl from the wrong side of town. Music had been her voice before she lost it. Lisa unclasped her hands and lifted them from her lap. She hovered her fingers over the keys. Her right hand felt stiff, her joints swollen from years of carrying trays. Her fingers were short, with bitten-down nails. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. They looked like working hands. The laughter in the room grew louder. Someone made a comment about her uniform. Another person asked for a refill on their wine. The disrespect hung in the air like smoke. It was the same disrespect she faced every single day. But tonight, under the bright lights, it stung more. They didn't believe in her. They didn't even believe she was human. She closed her eyes to block out the blinding light and the sneering faces she couldn't see. She blocked out the smell of the food and the sound of the money. She tried to find a quiet place in her mind, a place where there was no fear, just the sound of a melody she had written a long time ago. "Please," she whispered to herself, so softly that no one could hear. "Please let this work." She lowered her fingers. The silence of the crowd waited for a punchline that wasn't coming. Her trembling hands made contact with the cold ivory. This was it. There was no turning back. She was just a waitress, but for the next few minutes, she was the only thing standing between the restaurant and a disaster. She pushed down on the keys. The first sound that rang out wasn't soft. It was a loud, clashing chord that seemed to slap the silence in the face. It was a mistake, a moment of hesitation where her fingers landed too heavy on the keys. A ripple of snickers moved through the room like a wave. Heads shook in disapproval. People leaned back in their chairs, crossing their arms, ready to watch the train wreck. It was exactly what they expected. She was a waitress, not a musician. She was a joke. But Lisa didn't pull her hands away. She sat frozen for just a heartbeat, her fingers still pressed down on the keys. The vibration of the strings hummed against her fingertips, traveling up her arms and into her chest. It felt electric. It felt dangerous. She took a breath, ignoring the heat in her cheeks, and let the chord fade into silence. Then, she let her left hand drop an octave lower. She began to play again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't a scale, and it wasn't a famous pop song they knew. It was a slow, deep melody that crawled out of the bass notes. It sounded heavy, like the earth itself was groaning. The rhythm was strange. It wasn't a perfect beat you could tap your foot to. It was jagged and uneven, almost like a heartbeat that skips when you are afraid. The snickering in the room didn't stop immediately, but it changed tone. It became confused. People looked at each other, whispering. They were waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to start playing chopsticks, or to make a fool of herself so they could move on with their anger. But Lisa didn't stop. She kept playing the low notes, over and over, letting them build a foundation. Her eyes were still squeezed shut. Behind her eyelids, she wasn't in a fancy restaurant anymore. She was back in that tiny, drafty apartment she had lived in as a girl. She remembered the winter when the heating broke. She remembered sitting under 3 blankets, wearing her coat inside, watching her breath turn into white clouds in the air. The music she was playing now was the sound of that cold. It was the sound of shivering. It was the sound of being alone and scared that the cold would never go away. Slowly, her right hand began to move. It drifted higher up the keyboard, picking out a melody that floated above the heavy bass notes. It was a sad tune, but it was beautiful. It wavered a little, her fingers were stiff, and she wasn't used to the action of this high-quality piano, but the wobble made it sound more real. It sounded like a voice that was cracking with emotion. The man in the front row, the one with the expensive watch and the scowl, looked up from his phone. He had been typing an angry email to his business partner, but his thumb hovered over the screen. The sound was annoying him at first, but now it was curious. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect technique, but it had a pull to it. It demanded attention. Lisa didn't know the man was listening. She didn't know that the room was going quiet. She was lost in the memory. She remembered the day her mother got sick. She remembered the sterile white walls of the hospital and the smell of antiseptic that tried to hide the smell of sickness. She remembered the feeling of helplessness, sitting in a plastic chair, holding her mother's cold hand, wishing she had the power to fix things, wishing she was a doctor instead of a struggling musician. Her hands moved faster now. The music grew more complex. The left hand kept pounding out that sad, steady rhythm, while the right hand spun out notes that were sharp and piercing, like tears falling on glass. The piano began to roar. She wasn't holding back anymore. She forgot about the audience. She forgot about the manager sweating in the corner. She forgot about her uniform and the trays and the rent. She poured every ounce of her 20 years of silence into the instrument. She poured in the rude customers who treated her like dirt. She poured in the nights she cried in the break room because she was so exhausted. She poured in the grief of losing her mother and the grief of losing herself. The music swelled, filling the huge room. It bounced off the high ceiling and wrapped around the tables. The talking in the room stopped completely. It wasn't a gradual silence. It was like a switch had been flipped. One moment there was low murmuring and the clinking of silverware. The next there was only the sound of the piano. Waiters froze in the aisles, holding trays of food, forgotten. The chefs pushed open the kitchen doors to peek out, wondering what was happening. The angry man who had shouted for music earlier sat with his mouth slightly open. His glass of wine paused halfway to his lips. They weren't listening to a waitress anymore. They were listening to a story. And it was a story they all knew, even if they were rich and successful. They all knew what it felt like to be tired. They all knew what it felt like to lose something. Lisa's fingers started to ache, but she didn't care. She felt a strange rush in her veins, a feeling that she hadn't felt in decades. It was power. She was in control of this room. For the first time in her life, people weren't looking through her. They were feeling what she felt. She was connecting with them. The music climbed higher and higher, getting faster, more frantic. It was the sound of running, of trying to catch up, of life moving too fast. Then, suddenly, she slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a dissonant crash that echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. She pulled her hands back into her lap. The silence that followed was heavy. It was heavy enough to crush someone. The final notes of the crash seemed to hang in the air, vibrating, refusing to die away. Nobody breathed. The room was perfectly still. The air conditioning hummed, but it sounded deafening in the quiet. The spotlight on the stage felt hot on Lisa's skin. She could feel the sweat trickling down the back of her neck. She sat there, her chest heaving, her hands resting on her thighs. She was terrified to open her eyes. She was sure that when she did, she would see anger. She was sure that when she did, she would see anger. She was sure they would be laughing at her for being so dramatic. She thought they would throw their napkins and demand the real music. She waited for the shouting to start. She waited for the boos, but there was nothing. Just the beating of her own heart in her ears. Thump, 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 thump. She slowly peeled her eyes open. The light blinded her for a second, making her squint. As her vision adjusted, she couldn't see the customers clearly because of the glare, but she could feel them. The mood in the room had changed completely. The coldness, the arrogance, the impatience. It was all gone. In its place was something else. It was shock. It was awe. Lisa didn't know what to do. She wasn't a showman. She didn't have a charming speech prepared. She didn't know how to bow gracefully. She just sat there feeling small and exposed, wondering if she should just stand up and run back to the safety of the kitchen. Her hands were trembling again, worse than before. She looked down at them. They were red and marked from the keys, looking alien to her. She wondered if they could tell. Could they tell that the music wasn't just notes? Could they tell that it was her life? She felt naked, stripped of her uniform and her anonymity. She had shown them her soul, raw and bleeding, and now she had to sit there and wait for their judgment. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, but it wasn't an angry silence anymore. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected stops the world from turning. In the back of the room, a glass that a waiter had been tilting to fill paused in mid-air. The red wine shimmered under the lights, but no one was looking at it. Every single person in the dining hall was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Lisa kept her eyes fixed on the black and white keys. She didn't dare look up. Her hands were resting in her lap, trembling uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading. The skin on her fingertips felt hot and sensitive. She felt exposed, as if she had just stood up and told them all her deepest secrets without using a single word. She was sure that in a few seconds the spell would break. They would start laughing. They would say it was a cheap trick. They would demand the check. But then a soft sound broke the stillness. It wasn't a clap. It was the sound of someone exhaling a long, shaky breath, followed by the rustle of a linen napkin being used to wipe a face. Near the front, a woman reached out and grabbed her husband's hand. Her grip was tight. The husband, a man who spent his days yelling orders at subordinates, looked down at his wife and saw tears streaming down her cheeks. He didn't mock her. He didn't pull away. He squeezed her hand back, his own throat feeling strangely tight. The music had reached a place inside him that he had locked up years ago, a place he forgot existed. Lisa didn't know this was happening. She was too busy fighting the urge to run. She felt small and alone on the vast stage. She thought about the kitchen, about the safety of the stainless steel counters, and the predictable orders of medium rare and extra ice. She wished she was there. She wished she was never sat down. Then the noise started. It didn't start as a cheer. It started as a single person clapping. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate claps. Clap, 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 clap. Lisa flinched. She waited for the booing to mix in, but it didn't. A second person joined in, then a third. The clapping wasn't the polite, bored applause people gave after a background tune. It was different. It was hard. It was respectful. Slowly, hesitantly, Lisa lifted her head. The spotlight was still blinding, making it hard to see faces, but she could make out shapes. She saw that people were standing up. First just a few near the front, and then, like a wave moving through the room, everyone was getting to their feet. The room erupted. It wasn't just noise, it was a roar of appreciation. They weren't clapping for a performer, they were acknowledging a human being. In the center of the room, the famous critic, the one who was known for destroying careers with a single sentence, stood motionless. He didn't clap, he didn't cheer, he just stood there, looking at the woman in the worn black uniform. He had seen thousands of pianists in his life. He had seen technicians who played every note perfectly, like robots. He had seen virtuosos who played faster than the eye could follow. But none of them had made him feel like this. None of them had made him feel the ache in his own heart. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He usually wrote notes like boring, predictable, or waste of time. He clicked his pen, stared at the page for a long moment, and wrote one word: truth. The applause washed over Lisa like a physical force. It was warm, but it was also overwhelming. She didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to praise. She was used to complaints. She was used to complaints. She was used to complaints. She was used to Kennets. She was used to complaints. She was used to "this soup is cold," or "you forgot my water." This acceptance was foreign to her. It felt too big for her to hold. The manager rushed up the side stairs to the stage, his face beaming. He looked like he wanted to hug her, but he held back, seeing how fragile she looked. He stood next to her, clapping his hands raw, nodding his head at the crowd, as if to say, "Look at what I found. Look at who she is." Lisa looked out into the darkness beyond the lights. She couldn't see their eyes, but she could feel their energy. It wasn't hostile anymore. The barrier between the server and the served had dissolved. For those few minutes she played. She wasn't the invisible woman who filled the water glasses. She was the most important person in the room. She had taken them out of their fancy, shallow lives and dragged them down into the mud of real emotion, and strangely, they thanked her for it. A younger waiter in the corner, a boy named David who usually made fun of the older staff for being slow, stood with his mouth open. He looked at Lisa differently now. He saw the gray in her hair and the stoop in her shoulders, not as signs of weakness, but as evidence of a heavy burden she had been carrying. He realized that everyone had a story. He realized that the person clearing his table might be smarter, or more talented, or deeper than he could ever imagine. The applause went on for a long time. Minutes passed, and the crowd didn't sit down. They wanted more. They wanted to hear another piece. They wanted to hear what else she had hidden inside that tired soul. A shout came from the back. "Encore! Play another!" Lisa felt a panic rise in her chest. Another? She didn't have another. She didn't have a list of songs memorized. She had just played what she felt in the moment. She had emptied herself out. She had nothing left to give. The manager leaned in close to her ear so she could hear him over the noise. "They love you," he shouted, smiling. "Do you know anything else? Anything at all?" Lisa looked at her hands. They were trembling less now, but they felt heavy. She looked at the keys again. The temptation to stay was there. The dream she had buried for 20 years was scratching at the surface of her mind, trying to get out. This was her chance. This was the moment every musician waits for. The world was at her feet. She thought about her empty apartment. She thought about the silence there. She thought about how nice it would be to buy new curtains or fix her car. She thought about the respect. But then she looked at the crowd again. She saw their faces illuminated by the stage lights, expectant, hungry, wanting her to feed them more emotion. She realized that playing that song had cost her something. It had taken a piece of her heart and laid it out on the table. To play another one would mean cutting another piece off. She didn't know if she had enough pieces left to give without breaking completely. The noise began to die down slightly as people sensed her hesitation. They started to sit, whispering among themselves, wondering if she would continue. The manager looked at her with pleading eyes. He saw dollar signs, sure, but he also saw a chance to redeem himself for the disaster with the previous pianist. Lisa closed her eyes again. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of expensive perfume and anticipation. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She had done it. She had proven them wrong. She had proven to herself that the music was still there, alive and breathing, even after all these years. It didn't belong to the rich people. It didn't belong to the critics. It belonged to her. And because it belonged to her, she could choose to stop. She slowly stood up from the bench. Her legs felt shaky, like a newborn deer. She turned away from the piano, facing the darkness of the room. She gave a small, awkward nod. It wasn't a bow to royalty. It was a nod of acknowledgement between equals. It said, "I heard you, and you heard me." She didn't say a word. She didn't smile like a celebrity. She just turned and walked toward the stairs. The movement signaled the end. As she stepped down, the applause swelled up one last time, louder than ever, but she didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, walking toward the side curtain, toward the kitchen, toward the real world she lived in. She was leaving the fantasy behind, but she was taking a piece of the magic with her. The girl who played piano wasn't dead anymore. She was just sleeping. Lisa pushed through the heavy velvet curtains that separated the stage from the back hallway. As soon as she stepped behind them, the roar of the crowd became muffled, like hearing the ocean from underwater. The air back here was cooler and smelled of dish soap and old floor wax instead of expensive perfume. Her heart was still beating fast, fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird, but the shaking in her hands had stopped. She walked down the long, narrow corridor that led to the kitchen. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. With every step, she felt herself changing back into the person she was before. The magic of the spotlight was fading, being replaced by the harsh reality of fluorescent lights. She adjusted her uniform, straightening her apron and pulling the sleeves down over her wrists. She wasn't a pianist anymore. She was Lisa, the waitress who needed to clear table 4 before the customers complained. When she pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the noise hit her like a wall. The clanging of pots, the hissing of the stoves, and the shouting of orders were all happening just as they had an hour ago. For a second, time felt frozen. The kitchen staff had no idea what had just happened out front. To them, she had just been gone for a few minutes. But then, the head chef looked up. He saw her face. He saw the way she was walking, not with the tired shuffle she usually had, but with a strange, quiet grace. He stopped chopping the carrots. The line cooks stopped what they were doing too. One by one, they all turned to look at her. They had heard the music through the service speakers. They knew. "Lisa," the chef said softly. His voice sounded different. There was no bark in it tonight. He cleared his throat, looking a bit uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being nice. That was something else. Lisa didn't know what to say. She just nodded once, a small, shy smile touching her lips. Thanks, boss. She walked over to the sink to wash her hands quickly. The water was cold, shocking her skin, grounding her back in reality. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her face was flushed, her eyes were bright, and she looked lighter. The worry lines that seemed etched into her forehead yesterday were gone, or at least they didn't look as deep. Back in the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The angry, impatient crowd was gone. In its place was a room full of people who were deeply moved. They were eating their desserts now, but they were talking quietly. They weren't gossiping about business or complaining about the service. They were talking about the music. They were talking about how it made them feel. The famous critic was still sitting at his table. His notebook was closed and his pen was put away. He was staring at the empty stage, thinking about his wife, who had passed away 5 years ago. The music had made him miss her in a way that hurt, but it was a good kind of hurt. It felt like a release. He looked at his check and laid down a stack of cash that was 3 times the amount of the bill. When the manager came back into the room, he looked like a man who had just won the lottery. He was stopped by every table. People wanted to thank him. They wanted to know who the woman was. They wanted to tell him that it was the best performance they had ever heard. Who was she? A woman in a diamond necklace asked, her eyes wide. Is she a famous undercover performer? Is this a TV show? The manager shook his head, feeling a swell of pride that he had never felt before. No, he said honestly. She is Lisa. She has been working here for 15 years. She serves your soup. The woman looked stunned. She looked toward the kitchen doors, a new respect in her eyes. She realized she had been rude to this woman many times and never even known what she carried inside her. Lisa walked out of the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee cups. As she stepped onto the floor, the room felt different. It wasn't that the lights had changed or that the furniture was different. It was the people. As she walked past the tables, heads turned. People stopped talking. She approached the table where the critics sat. Earlier, he had treated her like she was invisible. Now, as she placed the coffee cup down, he looked up at her. His eyes were watery. "You have a gift," he said. His voice was raspy. He didn't say it to be polite. He said it like it was a fact. "Thank you for sharing it." Lisa looked at him, surprised. She didn't know who he was, and it didn't matter. "I'm just glad you liked it, sir," she said softly. She moved to the next table. The young couple there had been arguing when she first served them. Now, they were holding hands across the table. They looked up at her with genuine smiles. "That was beautiful," the girl said. "Really, truly beautiful." "Thank you," Lisa replied. And for the first time in her life, when she said those words, she actually felt a connection. She didn't feel like a servant. She felt like a person giving a gift, even if the gift was just a cup of coffee. At table 12, the man who had waved his hand at her earlier, dismissing her like a fly, stood up as she approached. He looked embarrassed. He looked at his own hands for a moment, then at her. "I apologize," he said stiffly. He wasn't good at apologizing, but he was trying. "I was rude. I didn't know." Lisa looked at him. She saw a human being who was just as flawed and lost as she was. "It's okay," she said. "We all have bad days." The man nodded, looking relieved. He sat down and left a tip on the table that was larger than Lisa's weekly paycheck. As the night went on, the restaurant emptied out slowly. Usually, this was the worst part of the shift time, when everyone was tired and grumpy, and the cleanup felt endless. But tonight, the air was light. The other waiters were looking at Lisa differently, too. They weren't just seeing the older woman who kept to herself. They were asking her questions. They were listening to her answers. "Do you play often?" David, the young waiter, asked her as they wiped down the counters. "Not anymore," Lisa said, wiping a cloth over the surface. "I haven't touched a piano in 20 years. I sold mine to pay for a furnace one winter." "That's sad," David said. "You should play again. You were amazing." Lisa paused. She looked around the empty dining room. The grand piano was still sitting on the stage in the dark, looking like a sleeping beast. She thought about what it would mean to play again. It would mean finding time. It would mean buying a cheap keyboard or finding a practice room. It would mean believing in herself again. "Yeah," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Maybe I will." The manager called everyone to the back office to split the tips. He handed Lisa an envelope. It was thick. "The customers were very generous tonight," he said. "And I added a bonus. You saved us, Lisa. You really did." Lisa took the envelope. She didn't count the money right there. She just held it. It wasn't about the money, though she knew it would help. It was about the feeling inside her chest. For 20 years, she had felt like a hollow shell, going through the motions of life, burying her dreams under layers of routine and survival. Tonight, the shell had cracked. The music had poured out, and along with it, the fear and the sadness. She walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air. The city was quiet, the streetlights humming. She got into her old car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. They were still rough and red, but now they looked like the hands of an artist. She turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. It still made that horrible noise, and the check engine light flickered on. But Lisa didn't feel the usual surge of panic or stress. She laughed. It was a light, happy sound that bounced around the small car. She had played a masterpiece tonight. She had silenced the critics. She had shown the world who she really was. And tomorrow, when she woke up, she would still be a waitress. She would still have bills to pay. But something had changed. The music was back inside her, and no one could ever take it away from her again. She drove home, humming a melody that hadn't been written yet, feeling like the main character in her own life for the very first time.